So on that question that we just left off on, this, the notion that one of the other things besides prophetic revelation that's consistent throughout the Old Testament narrative is this notion of the instantiation of man's connection with the divine through a particular territory and a particular lineage, blood and soil, to put it quite bluntly. Something I've been wrestling with over the course of the summer, because I've been, as I said, I've been conducting this other interview series on the history of Zionism, is the degree to which, from a Christian perspective, my understanding, and I believe you said this before, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from a Christian perspective, it sort of misses the point to fetishize the land and the people as opposed to the idea that Christ comes to represent.
This is a major, let's call it unsolved issue. And I think it is at the heart of the tension between Christianity and Judaism. So my understanding is that in the Old Testament, in some sense, the state, the possibility of the ideal state that's associated with a particular piece of land is a constantly recurring theme. So, but one of the, and this is a Christian reading now of the conjunction of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the idea essentially is something like, the ideal state is founded, and then it falters and decays, and then there's a collapse. And then the ideal state is founded, so that's Israel. It's founded and it falters and it collapses. And this happens multiple times. And so there's a problem there. The problem is as well, the promised land keeps collapsing on us, and then we're back into servitude and hell. And you can read that psychologically as punctuated development of society and of the individual, and that's fine. But what emerges out of that, from a Christian perspective, is the idea that the ideal state isn't a state, it's a state of being, right? It's a psychological state. Although that actually has practical ramifications, but the primary state is the psychological state.
And this goes back to our discussion earlier of those shared neuronal mechanisms, I suppose, right? Because the idea of being in a place and being in a place emotionally, to some degree, probably recruits the same neural circuitry, right? So this is how this may have come about.
Sure, exactly. It's piled. Well, yeah, and it's really, in some sense, it's also a psychologization, which is along the same line, and a development of the sophistication of the idea of place. Because, like, a place isn't just a geographical location. First of all, it's a place and a time, right? And so the same geographical place can be a very different place at different times. Like, you can die somewhere at one moment and not the other. Like, they're seriously different. But then there's also the psychological state of being, which is a really high-level abstraction. Like, it's no easy thing for an animal to divorce the idea of being away from the geographic locale. Very, very difficult. Now, the question might be, well, what's primary, the state itself or the state of being? Well, the Christianity, I would say, puts more emphasis on the state of being as the primary proper aim. It's something like that. Although, no, the promise, the kingdom of God from the Christian perspective is also the state that would obtain if everybody put the state of being before the state. So it's not like the state itself is banished from view, although it's certainly made subordinate to in some sense, to the psychological state. Now, the problem is, and this is a place where there's still the necessity of deep discussion, I would say, between Jews and Christians, and a lot of this is being played out in Israel. And I would say, in some sense, that's why the world's attention is focused on Israel. Because it's not self-evident why the world's attention is focused on the Middle East and Israel.
This is something that I wrestle with constantly. It gnaws at me, in an annoying sense, actually.
Yeah, well, it's very peculiar. It's like all eyes are on Israel to see how that plays out. It's the nexus of conflict. It's like, well, why? Why is that? It's not like there aren't other places ripe with conflict.
There are conflicts all over the world, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's a relatively small piece of land, and it's not that great a piece of land either, although it's obviously saturated with history, which is exactly the issue. Well, can you establish...
Unless it's dry and smaller than Vancouver Island. So,
right, exactly. Well, so there's a big experiment being played out there, and one experiment is, well, can you have a religious state? And the next experiment is, can you have a religious state that's a democracy? And then the next issue is, well, if you have a religious state that's a democracy, what do you do with the other citizens who don't share your religion? It's like, wow, we don't know what to do about that.
And it's complicated even farther in the case of Israel and Zionism, in that Judaism itself doesn't fit the category. Being a Jew or being identified as part of that religion, to use the English term, doesn't actually map on in the Jewish tradition so well to the Christian or maybe even Protestant notion of being a member of a religion by virtue of one's belief or creed, credo, right? Because it's very much, there's still this tribal element, this ethnic element to membership in this group.
Right, exactly.
So that's doubly confounding.
Yeah. So the Christian objection would be, you have to divorce that identity as the promised people, say in the promised land. You have to divorce that from the people and the land. You have to make it a high abstraction so that other people can partake of it, which is why Christianity is a universalizing religion.
Right.
Now, of course, the universalizing tendency also has its problems because it can become imperialistic.
That's right. But can one also argue that just in terms of the sociological development, we may be putting the cart before the horse in that analysis, in the sense that Christianity was the universalized version of the Jewish tradition, in the sense that to make it universally applicable, for it to succeed on the scale that it eventually did, it had to adapt that way. So it's a solution to a different problem.
Sure.
Right? And nonetheless, the Jewish solution to the Jewish problem has also persisted.
Right.
So to what degree, but something that I come back to, just to follow this line of thinking through, sort of finish the thought, is I know in the past you've said specifically that it's your belief or your sense that Christianity has a, and I'm not saying this as an argument for or against Judaism or any other tradition actually, but just out of curiosity, you've said that you believe Christianity has a unique solution to the problem of evil. But from this sociological perspective, I'm tended to think, if I choose this point of view, well, is it not just a solution to a different problem?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's actually partly why I've been going through the biblical series, is I'm trying to figure these things out, and as deeply as possible. I mean, there's a variety of solutions to the problems of adaptation. I mean, Islam is a solution, Judaism is a solution, Christianity is a solution, Buddhism is a solution. Well, you might say, well, which is the better solution? Well, one answer might be, well, none of them. They each have their advantages and disadvantages, and they play themselves out in the world that way.
And it may also depend on the problem to which they were posing themselves as a solution.
It certainly might. All eyes are on Israel, I suppose, in some part, because there's a particular kind of solution that's being applied there, and everyone's trying to figure out if it has any chance of succeeding. I mean, one of the problems with Israel is that, well, we've laid out a couple of them. So obviously the tension between the Israelis and the surrounding countries, that's a big problem. And it isn't obvious how that's going to be mediated. But it's also, Israel also has the problem of fragmentation from within. It's like you put all the Jews together and it turns out they're not all the same. And so they fight, and not that that's not characteristic of all other peoples, and I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, Europe, which was fundamentally Christian, was fragmented like mad. In that war, the Catholics and the Protestants were at war forever. They're probably still at war in some sense. So it's not unique to Judaism, but it is an indication of how difficult it is to use the state as the solution to the set of problems, because the state brings with it its own set of problems. So now, Christianity has psychologized a lot of this and divorced it, let's say, from ethnicity and from the land. And the question is, well, is there more utility in that solution, or is it a solution to a different set of problems? It's like, I don't exactly know. It's an alternative in that it spiritualizes the idea of nation and place, and that has certain advantages. Portability is one of them. Universality is another. Now, one of the disadvantages of that, and this is where I think the more enacted religious creeds, perhaps both Islam and Judaism would qualify, is that as you abstract the ideas, they tend to float off into space. It's something that Mircea Eliade talked about mean, Nietzsche announced the death of God, but Iliad said, well, look, this has happened to societies over and over again. As they proceed towards monotheism and God becomes more and more of an abstracted idea, the distance between God, so the distance between heaven and earth grows, because the more abstracted the God is, the less contact he has with earth, and sometimes he gets so abstracted that he just floats off and disappears.
Is that not precisely the space that then becomes open up to ideas like nationalism?
Oh, well, absolutely. And I mean, you see that happening in Christian Europe, is that especially after the Protestants.
Or in the alt-right movement.
Yes, well, that's a reaction to that. But one of the dangers of Protestantism, for example, is that it tends towards abstraction. Well, then you get fragmented Protestant cults, like many of them. And then you get, what seems to have happened is that the idea of God gets so abstracted that you can question it and then it goes away. Well, and then the whole culture shakes, right? Then everything's weak. So, I mean, all of these solutions have their attendant problems. And, well, we better do everything we can to sort them out, because it's of crucial importance at the moment, more than it has been for a long time, I would say.
If Christianity, theoretically, as you've said before, may have the best answer to, let's say, the problem of evil, and maybe when you said that, you meant the best within a certain
well, I was
context.
thinking not even that. Yeah.
Right, okay. So as the first part of that sentence, comma.
Yeah.
And if we were saying before that the challenges we face today, in respect to finding a shared narrative across these religious groups, whether they identify as religious or not, they have the cognitive and historical and emotional baggage of these different traditions. If that solution itself has to be religious in some sense, or at least negotiated on a religious plane, to what degree is that consistent, or is it helpful to think of Christianity as uniquely as a unique solution, a uniquely functional solution?
Good question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, partly I'm trying to find out the answer to that, I would say. I mean, so part of the reason that the biblical series has been successful is because I'm taking a psychological approach to it. Now, I'm not denying the potential utility of other approaches. So it's not a reductionist approach. It's just an approach from a particular perspective. It doesn't deny the utility of other perspectives. And so I think that means that more standard believers can listen, and that's okay, because I'm not saying what I'm saying is right or comprehensive. It's like there's plenty of room for different perspectives. But it's also attractive to the atheist types. So, because I'm not stating that the utility of this thinking is dependent on your belief, whatever that means, in a transcendent deity, okay? But I'm trying to talk about the abstract ideas and the psychological ideas in a way that's simultaneously abstract and concrete. And this is partly why it's partly why I rose, let's say, to notoriety last year when I said that I wouldn't use these pronouns. Is what happened was that I took an abstract argument and made it point specific, right? I said, no, that's one place that you don't get to go, and I don't care what the consequences are. And so that caused a flurry, and people said, well, why'd you pick that hill to die on? And the answer was, well, you have to make the abstraction into a point before it's real. And the point is somewhat arbitrary, and it's going to have pros and cons. I would have never guessed that I would get embroiled in a controversy over trans rights. It's like, it's preposterous and surreal in some sense.
You mean if you were to go back a decade? It's like
well, anytime, even now, it's like, it's not an issue that I was or am particularly concerned about. But what I was concerned about was the infringement on my right to use the words of my choice.
Right. So how is that instantiation concept reflected in the biblical series that you were discussing? Well,
one of the reasons that people are attracted to it, I think, is because I'm making that abstraction, the abstractions, concrete again. I'm taking the biblical narratives and I'm saying, well, what are the implications for your life right here and now as you practice, act, and perceive today and tomorrow?
Right.
Always. And when I've lectured, I have a rule for my lectures. It's like, the information has to be relevant, and relevant means that it has to change your perceptions and behaviors or your behaviors now or in a week or in a month, or it has to have some relevance for your understanding of society. Like it has to have practical relevance, always. And so the practical relevance here is, well, there's an injunction. You could call it a prophetic injunction. You could call it the injunction that came along with the establishment of Israel when Jacob wrestled with God, which is that you have a personal responsibility right now to, so Israel, from a psychological perspective, is the group of people who are wrestling with God, which I think it's a great idea. Wrestling isn't the same as believing. It's like, it's contending with, right? It's grappling with. And I mean, Jacob is maimed as a consequence of it. So it's and I really like that. It's sort of, it's the definition of belief in the Old Testament is something like being willing to wrestle with God. And God will wrestle back. And sometimes he'll even, well, like in the Jacob story, he basically loses. It's unbelievable, you know. He blesses Jacob. And you think, well, that doesn't go along with the idea of a tyrannical, patriarchal God very well at all.
God tapping out. No,
yeah,
it
exactly.
doesn't really work.
It's like, okay, and that's a fundamental story. I mean, that's the story of the foundation of Israel. It's like, it's a major foundational story. So anyways, I'm trying to walk through these narratives, the narrative of Abraham, and let's say, and make that practical. And so the Abrahamic practicality is, well, God calls and says, get the hell away from the place of security and go out there into the world and found a people. And don't assume that you get to go from the place of security to the promised land without the intervening catastrophe of life, right? And it's an echoing of what God tells Adam after he kicks him out of the Garden of Eden, essentially, you know, that life's going to be difficult. And so Abraham goes out, he listens to God. It's not like good things happen. It's like terrible things happen right away. And I think, well, that's really useful to know because,
Here be dragons.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, when you might say that in the Freudian sense, if religion is nothing but a wish fulfillment, then the religious injunction would be something like, well, you know, follow God and everything will turn out all right. Well, no one believes that because it just doesn't happen that way. And this is much more realistic. It's like, well, your final destiny, it's necessary to undergo this process of emergence out into the world and the founding of a people, which is to find a mate and to reproduce and all of that and to do that in a proper manner. It's a call to adventure, but it's real grappling with the world at the same time. The fact that God is there with you, so to speak, doesn't mean that you're going to have a charmed life. And people find that very realistic because they don't have charmed lives. And so it's uplifting to them. And it's uplifting for them to know that even those people who were chosen by God in the narrative still are ground up by the world in every possible way, in even more extreme ways maybe than modern people are.
I suppose the visceral reality of that, the degree to which that reflects our actual lived experience, is sort of the inverse of why people find cults as opposed to religions a little bit creepy, in the sense that the flavor of a cult often, I think, is that, you know, everything is great.
Right.
If you drink our Kool-Aid, everything is already perfect.
Exactly.
Which doesn't really resonate with people outside of that state of mind. It doesn't really resonate with the reality of lived human experience.
That's exactly right.
So the conflation of religion with cult, I think, which often emerges in the New Atheist movement, right? I think misses that particular point.
Yeah, I think it does too. I mean, you know, there's the opiate of the masses argument and the wish fulfillment argument with regards to religion. You know, Dawkins goes on the Freudian line more than the Marxian line. He thinks that, well, it's what, primitive, self-satisfying superstition. Well, then why are the stories constructed that way? They're not follow God and everything will be all right. That isn't how it works.
It's not one long lullaby.
It's not that at all. It's real catastrophes, major catastrophes of all sorts continually, but with this underlying notion that if you stay on the proper path, or at least try to stay on the proper path even, you don't actually have to be on it, you just have to try, that's your best bet. And so, like with the hero mythology, all of which these are examples of, you might say, well, is that's the solution to life's problems, is to take the path of the hero. And the answer to that is no. It's just your best bet. Because it isn't obvious that such a thing as the ultimate solution to life's problems exists. There's arbitrariness in the world and randomness and all of those things. But given all that, what's your best strategy? And one strategy as well, and this is partly how I make these stories practical, is like accept the tragedy of your destiny and move forward consciously and voluntarily nonetheless. And part of the reason that the audience is packed with men is because men really like that story. They really and need it. That's what men need to do.
Is it that men need to do it inherently and intrinsically, or is it that we've reached a point in our society in the West where that is what has become missing for men?
I think it's both of those. It's both of those, is that is the archetypal reality of male life, is to go out and confront the dragon and bring home the gold and get the girl.
And not for women?
Women are more complicated, because here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine that there's two fundamental archetypes for behavior. One would be, I'll use Christian symbolism for this, because it simplifies things. One would be Christ, let's say, and so that's the bearer of the truth, right? And that would be associated with St. George and the hero mythologies, all of that. It sort of culminates in that symbolic figure. And then the other one is the Virgin and the Child. Okay, so then you think, well, you've got these two archetypes. Well, for women, they're like this. The Virgin and the Child is the dominant archetype, and the Christ archetype is behind that. And for men, it's the Christ archetype is out in the front, and the Virgin and the Child is behind. And by behind, I mean, well, male humans are quite maternal, and female humans are quite masculine. Like, we're not that sexually dimorphic. We're sexually dimorphic, but not that much. And so the archetypal...
Statistically, we're sexually dimorphic, but on an individual basis,
there's a lot of overlap.
There may be more fluidity.
Yeah, well, there is. And there's masculine women and feminine men and all of that, you know. Although, and that's because of the archetypal structure that I just described as a reflection of that. Well, for men, no, it's still primarily the call to adventure. Now, you know, feminists might say, well, it's also primarily the call to adventure for women. But it's not. Because women have to solve the problem of infants, and they have to do that before they're 35. And that's a fundamental reality, and the feminists, speaking broadly, will not contend with that. Well, and that's why most women don't describe themselves as feminists. It's a very tiny minority of women who do, is they won't speak to that. There was a good article published just a week or so ago looking at temperamental differences between self-professed feminists and non-feminists, and the self-professed feminists were far more masculine in their temperamental characteristics. So, you know, so it makes sense, but it doesn't speak to deeply feminine women who are primarily and somewhat shamefully, in their own eyes, oriented fundamentally towards family. You know, so and we haven't sorted that out. Well, that's partly because we haven't sorted out the consequences of the birth control pill, you know, because it sort of freed up women in some sense to primarily act like men. But that doesn't work so well for women because they're not men. It also doesn't work very well for society because women in their virgin mother and child role are absolutely necessary. That's a sacred image, in that if you don't worship that image and regard that dyad as of the highest value, like equivalent in some sense to the representation of the hero, then your society doesn't reproduce, for example, and then there aren't any more of you. And that's definitely a problem if you think of such things as a problem in the West. I mean, people can throw up their hands and say, well, it doesn't matter which sort of people populate the world, or maybe there's too damn many of us anyways, but like that doesn't really
or one could
address
argue,
the issue.
The devil we know doesn't necessarily mean that it's superior to a future equilibrial state that we don't know.
Right. I mean, you can make those cases, but the reality of that to some degree is that societies that don't propagate. They don't last. And so we are the result of those societies that have lasted.
Hi guys, Jordan here from Behind the Lens at Transliminal Media. First of all, I just wanted to say a big heartfelt thanks to those of you who have signed up as patrons. Your support is so crucial. I literally would not be able to devote time to produce this kind of quality material without you. So truly, thank you for being a part of this. And for any newcomers, if you've been enjoying this interview series, chances are I like your taste. So I just want to take a quick moment to give you a chance to be part of something exciting from the ground up. What am I talking about? Well, my goal is to steadily ramp up production of these high-quality, in-depth interviews that we're creating for the world to see, with captivating, authoritative guests on topics from psychology, mythology, and religion, to history, politics, and philosophy. I also want to make this content available as a podcast. I admit I like that you enjoy my eye-catching cinematography, but I also want you to be able to listen hands-free while you do productive stuff, like cleaning your room. To keep giving all this to you, though, I need your support. I do contract work for a living, and like I said, to afford the time I need to keep creating this kind of high-end material that I want so badly to give you, I need a production budget. So if you've been enjoying what I've given you guys so far, please visit www.patreon.com/transliminal. That's patreon.com/transliminal. There you can sign up as a patron for just $5 per creation. Or if you literally can't afford that, as little as $1. Whatever price works for you. As a patron, you get to have direct input on what you'd like me to investigate, who you'd like me to interview, and what kinds of questions you want answered. Not only that, but when you are a Transliminal patron, you get private access to early release raw interview content with behind-the-scenes bonus material that no one else gets to see or hear. So before watching the rest of the interview, please take a moment to check out patreon.com/transliminal. In keeping with the holiday spirit, once we hit our first target budget, I'll also donate some of the funds to a charity of my patron's choice, as a thanks to all of you who believe in the value of this material. So thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. Be sure to come back afterwards to enjoy the rest of the interview.
I mean, one of the things that's extremely interesting about the Old Testament narratives that really differentiates those old people from us is that they're very, very, very concerned with their lineage. It's a primary concern, like they view themselves as founders of a potential state. They're attempting to generate progeny and to make them thrive. It saturates every element of their thinking. And the atomized individuality of the Western individual has no place for that at all. It's not how we conceptualize ourselves.
In Israel, again, to go back to the time I was spending there this previous summer, and the line of discussion we had just a few minutes ago, that's the demographic issue and whose progeny is so central to the lived reality and feasibility of this national project. I mean, so for maybe
right,
for those of us in Canada, multicultural Canada or the United States, melting pot, mixing pot model, it seems extremely antiquated. But for many people, and I think Israel is really just an example of this, perhaps a primary one or a lightning rod, as we said before, but this is no less real now than it
No,
than
and it's
it
certainly
was
become
then.
a major issue in Europe, massively major issue, and that's
Precisely.
only going to grow. You know, the problem with the demographic projections is that they're assumption-based, you know, and so if you look at the projections that indicate like the rapid rise of Islam and the rapid decline of, let's say, traditional European culture and ethnic identity, they're predicated on the idea that the current birth rate among Islam immigrants is likely to persist. And you can, who knows about that? It's an assumption. And so as you project out into the future, the error bars around your projection grow, and you know, you can pick whichever extreme you want to justify your political argument. But all that doesn't matter. What matters is that the argument is being had. And so, and we don't know what the consequences of that will be. And I would say the rise of the more nationalistic sentiments, like the identitarian movement, that's actually happening among people who are young primarily. So, yeah, well, so it's another indication of where Israel's the focal point, because these things are being played out at a more accelerated rate, something like that. And so everyone's watching. Okay, well, you've just founded a religious state and you had your reasons for it historically, and like historically speaking for over thousands of years, but also more recently. Okay, you're putting that into practice. Oh, now you've got a problem. You've got demographic race issues. Well, isn't that ironic? Well, it is, but not easy to, it's very difficult to figure out what to do about that.
Yes, especially because in Israel itself, the idea of a religious state, even if you were to use that terminology in Israel for arguably the majority of the population, that would be, people would recoil at that term because for them they don't see it as a religious state.
Right.
Right. It's the state of a people.
Right.
But again, from the Western perspective, I suppose, from the Christian perspective, the idea of Judaism is almost inseparable from, like, it means one and the same for an observer who doesn't necessarily regard themselves as part of that identity group. So I suppose that's just another interesting sort of wrinkle in the set of problems that's playing out in that space. But so to bring this full circle, going forward, because you're going to be continuing with this Bible series at a different pace, nonetheless, but continuing with it is my understanding,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So,
well, I think it might be the most significant thing that I'm doing. I mean, I've tried to sort through what I'm doing and what the consequences are. I don't know how to do that because what's happened over the last year has been so absolutely insane. And I have no framework of reference within which to put it. And it's a reflection of underlying technological transformations that I don't understand and that are accelerating. So I've been trying to sort through my priorities and guess at what I should not let go no matter what. And I do think that this biblical series is that. And partly it stretches me intellectually tremendously because I'm going through material that I'm not super familiar with. I know a number of the biblical stories very deeply, but many of them I don't. So I'm learning a lot under intense deadlines in order to produce this series. I want to do it indefinitely. I don't know what indefinitely means, especially under the current circumstances. So
as observers and people that are partaking in this exploration of yours, or what are the sorts of insights that you're going to try to mine out for yourself as well as for us?
Well, I want to see how the emergent idea of the Messiah develops in the Old Testament texts, as a reflection of the prophetic tradition, for example. So I'm trying to understand the emergence of the idea of the universal Savior, something like that. And the universal Savior, speaking psychologically, is something like the delineation of the pattern of adaptation that works for the individual and for the family and for the society, all at the same time across spans of time.
The meta-solution.
Exactly, the meta-solution. That's exactly it. And that's what we're looking for, because the meta-problem is the tragedy of life and malevolence. That's the meta-problem. And there's a meta-solution, which is the diminution of those negative realities. So, and that's what people are struggling to do. It's like we obviously resist and attempt to overcome individual tragedies. But even the word tragedy indicates that there's a meta-tragedy. Otherwise, there's a meta-catastrophe. That's tragedy itself.
Right. There has to be a context for that term even to make sense,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. Or the fact that the term does make sense means that we generalize across tragedies. So we think of them as a class. And the idea of evil is the same thing, is that we take individual acts of malevolence and we assume a common generality that pertains across them. And that becomes a meta problem that demands a meta solution. And in this new book I wrote called 12 Rules for Life, I have a chapter in there. I think this is in treat yourself as if you were someone that you're caring for. I'm trying to describe in there why people don't treat themselves very well. It's because we're contemptuous of ourselves because we're fragile, mortal, vulnerable, fallible, all of those things. And that we know it very well, especially about ourselves, and that we also are touched by malevolence. And so we have a very uncomfortable relationship with ourselves. And so the crucifixion story, in some sense, or the passion story, is a story of the encounter with that, right? Because Christ encounters Satan himself, that's malevolence per se, and also undergoes what you might regard as the archetypal tragedy, which is torture for virtue, right? That's the best kind of punishment if you're going to punish someone. Betrayal and then torture for virtue. And so it's an archetypal story because the two meta problems are put forward as paramount. And the messianic passion is an attempt to delineate out in narrative form what might be done about that. And so I want to trace that. It's like there's a meta solution that's attempting to emerge in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. It's, those are related. Obviously, Christians and Jews disagree about how those things are related, and of
nonetheless,
course...
the concept of the Messiah, of the Messianic figure, is rooted deeply in Jewish eschatology, right?
Absolutely.
It's just a question of
when.
Precisely.
And who, yeah. But that is the question.
Or
right?
what?
Yes.
Is the state, because there are lines of thinking within the essentially Jewish religious right in Israel that says the emergence of the state, or the instantiation of the state of Israel, is precisely that.
Right.
The people at the forefront of the settlement movement, view it in very explicit terms. That's how they've come. That is the theology that has emerged. They decided, oh wait, the groundwork has been laid for us to precisely bring that about in a non-personified form, in a collective form.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, that's an issue that could be talked about forever, because I would say one of the hallmarks of state utopian thinking is the idea that the state can be the Messiah. Now, I don't believe that. I think that's it's tricky though, because even with the Christian conception of the kingdom of God, it's not like it's completely divorced from the state as such, but it's more the causal direction. It's that there's a psychological transformation that has to occur before the state can be what it could be. And you can reverse that. You can say, no, there's a state transformation that has to be made before the individual transformation can come about. And like you might say, that's an argument that's been raging through the 20th century, right? So, and it's a wicked argument. And we obviously can't go into its details now, but anyways, that's basically my plan for the biblical series. And I'm obviously trying to learn as much as it's an exploration rather than a statement of what I already know. And I don't want it to be a statement of what I already know. I'm really trying to grapple with the stories. And that's why I found the meaning of the word Israel so interesting.
So on that note, on the flip side, so as I continue my investigations which are going to be in interview form, sporadically perhaps, periodically, so our viewers will be able to see these emerging online over the course of the next foreseeable future. Do you have questions from your own perspective about how this plays out in material reality in today's day and age?
I have a major question, and the question, because the fundamental issue, I suppose, that I want to contend with is the idea of the resurrection of Christ. That's the central Christian issue. Everything hinges on that. I'm trying to figure out exactly what that means, and I mean, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I can make a case psychologically and that works. Like, it's the dying and resurrecting hero that is the messianic figure. And that's a psychological reality, because when you learn something new that updates you, a little part of you, which is made of your old presuppositions, has to die. And so you have to be willing to let go of parts of yourself all the time and let them burn off and die in order to move forward into the future. And so you could say that the ultimate human being, in some sense, is the person who's ultimately willing to do that. And so that's the psychological idea of the dying and resurrecting hero. But that's not enough, because it's not enough. It's not deep enough, because I don't know the cosmic significance, let's say, of the integrated psyche. And no one does. Well, consciousness plays a role in being when we don't understand that role. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, to the degree that God's communicative capacity is the generative force of reality itself, there's a notion that consciousness, in my view anyways, which is part of the image of God that characterizes human beings, plays a causal role in the genesis of reality. And I believe that. I think that that's what individual people do with their consciousness, is they look at a field of potential, that's the chaos, the tohu vabohu. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong.
Tohu vabohu.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's everywhere, always. And you grapple with that, that's the realm of possibility, and you concretize that, and you snap that into being. That is what we do. Well, so what does that mean in the final analysis? Like, I think it means that we're choosing between good and evil. We're choosing between heaven and hell all the time, in actuality, as well as psychologically. And so then, if that's the case, and that consciousness plays a constitutive role in the unfolding of the destiny of being, and I see no reason to disbelieve that, then what's the cosmic significance of the person who gets aligned across all levels simultaneously? Because that's also this messianic figure brings everything together, right? So it's put into a unity of individual, family, society.
Well, here's
everything.
Here's the thing, because the way you're articulating it, you conceive of it as an individual. But as we were just talking about, for some groups in the Middle East right now, it's viewed as a collective project.
Yes.
I don't know where that leads.
Right. Well, that's it. That's partly what I'm trying to figure out. And there is in Christianity, even though it's heavily psychologized and abstracted, there still is a relationship with the actual state. So it might be, I don't know, and you can see this echoed in Buddhist thinking too. So Buddha, of course, attains nirvana, and so he's lined up perfectly. Everything's lined up around him. But it's not perfect because, I said that wrong. There's enough aligned around the Buddha to put him in an enlightened state. But in that enlightened state, he realizes that not everything is aligned, and that also includes other people. And so he can't just stay in this transcendent state. He has to return to humanity and gather everyone together so that everyone can be illuminated, because it's insufficient for just the individual to be illuminated. So you see there the relationship between individual and state. Even if the individual is illuminated, the state also has to be, or it's an incomplete, you could think about it as an incomplete incarnation. And in some sense, that's echoed in Christianity with the idea that there'll be a second coming, because for some reason the first coming wasn't sufficient. So that problem remains unsolved. Now, my sense of it is that, and I think this is partly why the work I'm doing is echoing. I'm telling people, well, in this state of increasingly intense polarization and identity politics and reversion to group identity, your job is to center yourself on the issues at hand in your own life and sort them out. Put yourself together, discipline yourself, fix the things around you that you can fix. And I think that if we do that individually and collectively, that's our best path forward. And people are resonating to that. And I think the reason for that is, well, it gives each individual a destiny, especially when you conjoin that with the idea that, like, make no mistake about it, your individual choices actually matter way more than you think they do. Like, we are collectively, individually and collectively, simultaneously determining the course of reality. We're piloting this ship. And I truly believe that. And it's a collective enterprise, but it's also to a surprising degree an enterprise that depends on every individual. Like, look at what happened in Charlottesville. One guy, right, he probably increased polarization in the United States by, let's say, 5 to 10%, something like that, right? And we're going to see a whole series of crisis points like that unfold over the next few years, where if one person seriously misbehaves, everyone will stretch apart, and everyone will stretch apart. And so
it seems easier to break than to put back together as well. It doesn't seem to be linear.
Well, right, definitely. It's always easier. That's another reason why I suggest to the people who are watching the work that I'm doing that they should concentrate on their own affairs, because it's a lot easier to break things than it is to put them together. And so you also want to limit the damage you can do if you're wrong. So you should practice in your own locale. And that's why this idea of cleaning up your room has become an internet meme. It's like, and it's correct. A woman came up to me the other day, really literally yesterday. She was about 28 or so. And she said, she wanted to thank me for putting my lectures online. And she said, look, I did what you said. I cleaned up my bedroom. I put it in order. And she said, and then all of a sudden my kitchen was cleaned. And then my house was ordered. And now I'm starting to do the same thing in realms outside of that. She said, that really works. It's like, yeah, it does really work. But it's humble, right? Because you start local and with trivial things that are beneath you even. And there's humility in that, and you're not going to make a big mistake. And so I think that that's the right level of analysis for us to make conflict-free progress during the next decade. We're in a very strange state at the moment, and it's going to get stranger because the rate of technological innovation is accelerating madly. You know, I was thinking yesterday, and maybe we can end on this. I've been talking to a lot of people about the emergence of AI, and many observers think that that's 5 years, fundamentally, before we produce a computer that, number one, has the computing capacity of a human brain, might be as close as 18 months away, and number two, that's capable of designing the next intelligent machine.
A machine that could design a machine.
Right,
Yeah.
and then that's Kurzweil's singularity, because as soon as that happens, it happens at an increasingly accelerating rate to the point of infinite computational power. Well, we have no idea what infinite computational power means. So I think, well, here's a scary thought, like we're bringing into being a super intelligence. Well, it better be an ethical one. And whether or not it's an ethical one is going to be determined by the choices people make when they design this thing. And so, like, we better get our act together, because we're also collectively designing it.
Yeah, and you can see positive and negative repercussions of that just in the way that social media is being used.
Yeah.
Like for instance, with the recent sexual harassment scandals, this awakening and this speaking out about what's happened just in the past few weeks is inconceivable without the technological tools that people have at their disposal now.
Yeah, well, it certainly amplifies the power of an accusation, right?
That's
so
right.
You say,
it works
well,
both ways, I suppose.
It works both ways, exactly. So what that means is that what you gain in terms of transparency, say, and the ability of genuinely assaulted people to step forward, you potentially lose by handing power to those who are willing to make unfounded accusations. So yeah, that's a good example of the ethical minefields that are developing as a consequence of the emergence of, well, we'll say artificial intelligence, because that's exactly what's happening. And Google and YouTube are struggling with that too, and Facebook. It's like, well, what sort of communications do we actually allow? Or do we even allow communications? And what's the danger of not allowing them? And it's like, yeah, these are major questions. So, and I'm afraid that they'll be answered in ideological ways, and that's not good. That's seriously not good. You know, there's no doubt that YouTube and Google and Facebook are building censor AIs. That's what they're doing. Now, they have their reasons. You don't want child pornography. You don't want snuff films, right? You don't want ISIS beheadings used as tools for enticing young people into a totalitarian regime. There's reasons for them to be concerned, but the precise boundaries, especially when you encode it in literally, you put it literally in code, the boundaries really matter. So one of the things I learned from reading Jung that really struck me was, you know, his contention was, we left our ethical development, the pathway for our ethical development at the time where science split from alchemy. And the scientific aspect of that has exploded. But the ethical element has remained unchanged. And that's no good, because we need an ethics that's as potent as our technology, or our technology will destroy us. And that seems to me to be incontrovertible.
And the solution in your mind, or one's best bet, as you said before, you feel, or in your experience anyway, if I'm phrasing it correctly, lies at the individual level.
Yep, that's the, yes.
Which to genuinely wrap this up, because I know we've gone over time and you have other things to do, but to wrap this up, you'd mentioned before how, you've talked on other people's programs about the self-authoring suite and this new understanding yourself.
Understandmyself.com.
Understandmyself.com. So maybe you can just briefly tell us about that. And I, if I remember correctly, you said you had a code.
So I've got a code which is Jordan, capital. It's referring to you,
thank you.
And also to me, but
the meta Jordan.
Yes, exactly. So the meeting of two Jordans, yes.
Memers go.
Yeah. Right. So the self-authoring suite helps people write about their past experiences to clarify them, and to write about their present virtues and faults and to magnify the former and delimit the latter. And the future authoring program allows people to make a plan for the future, so they have something to aim for and something to avoid, right? And then to delineate that. And so we offer that. We have a fall 2-for-1 special on that, and this code entitles you to a 20% discount on that. And then the Understand Myself system is the Big 5 aspect scale, which gives you a Big 5 trait reading of your personality, but each of the traits is differentiated into 2 aspects. So you get a high resolution model of your personality, and that can aid in self-understanding, because what you want to do in life is you want to modify your temperament so it broadens out. So if you're an introvert, you want to develop the skills of extroversion, and if you're an extrovert, you want to learn how to be alone, for example. So you can broaden your personality capacity. But nonetheless, you have a character, and your best bet is to know your character and find an environmental niche in which that will work. So for example, if you want to go into the military, it's really a good idea to be high in conscientiousness and and low in neuroticism. You need that to be successful in the military. So if you want to be an entrepreneur or a creative artist, then you need to be high in openness and maybe not quite so high in conscientiousness, because you'll get too guilty about the fact that your days are unstructured and you don't have any routine and that the future's uncertain. And so, and if you're high in agreeableness, you should probably work with people. And so the Understand Myself system, which is relatively new, gives you what we think is the most accurate, highest definition model of your personality that you can currently obtain.
That's really, I've done it, and I found it really interesting. So, but I didn't know necessarily, should I be interpreting it as here are dimensions where I can genuinely work towards expanding my my repertoire of subroutines,
yep,
to use your terminology, or is it more a sense of here is the niche you should find for yourself?
Well, I would say it's actually more of the niche, because you need to take your temperament into account. It's what you are, but it's not what you could be. And what you could be involves the learning of new subroutines from the micro level up. Like if you have an introvert and they need to learn how to be extroverted, they need to learn the subroutines, the micro routines, how to introduce themselves in public, how to speak. The extroverts figured that out because they were inclined in that direction. They figured that out when they were like 4.
It's a non-conscious decision.
Right, yeah, that's right. It's part of their substructural wiring. That's another way of thinking about it. We think...
But is it reasonable to think there is malleability?
Oh yeah, there's malleability. People get more conscientious, more agreeable, and more emotionally stable as they get older. And I mean, there's malleability because you can learn, but it's bounded malleability in that, think about it this way, maybe there's a normal distribution and you're attached to a point. That's your average level of that trait. And then there's a spring attached to that point. And the harder you pull, the harder it is to pull more. And that's a reasonable way of thinking about the relationship between genetic predetermination and environmental variability. It's like you can move yourself from that point, but the farther you want to move, the harder it gets.
Oh, it's an interesting metaphor. Okay, yeah. And for viewers that actually participate in this and engage in it, when they read through the results, this is something for them to keep in mind. It's that metaphor of that there is modification, there is give for modification in the system, but it's bounded, and the farther you get from...
Yeah, so if you're really high in trait neuroticism, so you're prone to anxiety and negative emotion, like you can stabilize yourself through exposure, right? So don't avoid things you're afraid of. Especially, I should be more specific about that. If you're on a path to somewhere, you've delineated the path, and things emerge that you're afraid of, that if you avoided would compromise your journey forward, don't avoid them. Break them into pieces, learn how to confront them, and that will strengthen you, and it'll strengthen your character, and it'll lower your levels of neuroticism. But you're never, in all likelihood, going to go from 98th percentile of neuroticism to like 2nd percentile. You could, but you'd have to do nothing but that your entire life, and even then it might not work. So maybe if you meditated carefully in a Tibetan retreat and you didn't have to worry about anything else, you could shift yourself 2 or 3 standard deviations. But the amount of effort is proportional to the movement, right? So it's a give and take, a dance almost between making peace
and extending one's personality in the dimensions one can.
Yeah. Well, it's exactly what you do when you're in a relationship with someone, right? You sort of take them as they are, but you're mutually engaged in refining each other as well. But there are limits, you know. I mean, you have to, the person has a character that has to be taken, same with children. They have a character that needs to be taken into account. So.
And I guess your argument here is that we can view ourselves the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We went over time, but again, I think it was worth it.
It was good. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Nice to see you again.